How's that, better? I want to acknowledge Congressman Ted Lieu, who, at his request, we organized this hearing today, and I'm sure he'll have more to say when he gets here. I also want to welcome our witnesses, and I want to thank them for their willingness to share their expertise and on-the-ground experience with us today. Ambassador Jeffrey, let me take this opportunity to thank you for your many years of dedicated service as a United States career diplomat. During the 114th Congress, this commission has devoted considerable attention to the armed conflicts in Syria and Iraq and their devastating consequences for the civilian population. We have consistently expressed our concern that these conflicts are being conducted in ways that undermine the norms of international humanitarian law, or IHL, that both the states and the non-state actors who are fighting these wars are purposefully targeting civilian populations and infrastructure instead of protecting them as they are obligated to do under international law. All of us have seen the pictures and heard the stories of the people who live with constant shelling or are being used as human shields or are under siege and starving, or whose schools and medical facilities have been destroyed and their doctors killed. Shameful practices that are far too prevalent and systematic to be considered collateral damage, and that the development of IHL after World War II was meant to end. Today we will look at another conflict that raises many of the same concerns, but has received much less attention: the 20-month-old conflict in Yemen. The Yemen conflict is over governance. It started March of 2015 when Saudi Arabia and members of a coalition it established launched a military operation to restore the rule of Yemen's internationally recognized President Hadi. Prior to the start of hostilities, Hadi's government had been gradually supplanted by an alliance comprised of the Houthi movement and loyalists of the previous president, Ali Abdullah Saleh. The United Nations has estimated that through August of 2016, this war had killed at least 10,000 people. According to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, there were 3,980 civilian casualties from the start of hostilities through September of this year. Of a population of 21.2 million, more than 3 million have been internally displaced. Before the conflict, Yemen was already a poor country. Today, 80% of the population is in need of humanitarian assistance. I want to draw particular attention to hunger. UNICEF estimates that 14 million Yemenis are malnourished and that 370,000 children are severely malnourished or starving, particularly in rural areas. According to the World Food Program, almost half of all children in Yemen are stunted in growth due to chronic malnutrition. This is a country that is completely devastated. And once again, this horrible devastation is due in great part to the way the war has been conducted. In its most recent report on the human rights situation in Yemen, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights documented, and I quote, "substantial allegations concerning possible violations of international humanitarian law in the context of the conduct of hostilities in Yemen," end quote, including rocket and mortar attacks on residential areas, allegations of the use of landmines, and sniper attacks by Houthi Saleh forces. On the part of the Saudi-led coalition, the High Commissioner documented attacks on markets, weddings, residential buildings, and public and private infrastructure, and allegations of the use of cluster bombs. The UN estimates that the majority of the civilian casualties in the war are attributable to coalition forces. The problem, of course, is that the coalition is backed by the United States, which has provided a full range of security assistance to Saudi Arabia, everything from small arms and ammunition to tanks and armored vehicles to combat aircraft, bombs, and more. U.S.-provided equipment has been used to prosecute the war. The UN High Commissioner's report I just cited includes photos of remnants of cluster munitions with American markings. So there is a growing concern here in the House and in the Senate that the U.S. could be in violation of our own laws prohibiting military sales or the provision of security assistance to countries that engage in gross violations of human rights. So this is what we're here to discuss today. And I recognize that in the aftermath of the October 2016 Saudi airstrike on a funeral haul that killed between 130 and 150 people, the administration announced that it was initiating a review of U.S. security assistance to Saudi Arabia. That was an appropriate step. But we don't yet know the outcome of that review, nor whether other steps we have taken on training and intelligence sharing will be enough to change the conduct of the war, nor protect us from charges of complicity for the consequences of that conduct. So what I am convinced of is that the weakening of humanitarian norms that we've seen in the first years of this century does not serve our strategic interests, nor those of our allies. So we must take steps to restore respect for the obligation to protect civilians. I think this is an important moment to have this hearing, and I would like to yield for any opening comments to my colleague, Congressman Ted Lieu, who is responsible for this hearing happening today.
Right. Thank you, and thank you, Chairman McGovern, for holding this hearing along with Chairman Pitts. I really appreciate your long history of standing up for human rights. I don't have a philosophical objection with the U.S. helping an ally such as Saudi Arabia. I do have a strong objection when the conduct of that military operation looks like it's doing war crimes. And the reports on the ground from reporters as well as from human rights organizations have documented over 70 unlawful airstrikes. I can understand if there's one or two or maybe three errant bombs, but when it's over 70, then that suggests to me either the Saudi-led military coalition is intentionally targeting civilians or they just don't care. And the funeral that Representative McGovern references is very interesting because if you look at the response from the military coalition, first of all, they admit that they targeted that funeral ceremony. What they say is they had intelligence that there would be some rebel leaders there. Under the law of war, even if that was true, you can't do that. I taught the law of war when I was active duty in the Air Force. I'm a graduate of Air War College, and as all of you know, under the law of war, you have to apply principles of proportionality, military necessity. So you can't target a funeral ceremony with hundreds of civilians and cause that much collateral damage. That is just a straight violation. So I'm not even clear that the military coalition itself understands the principles of international law or of the law of war. I'd like to know what the U.S. has done in terms of trying to mitigate this coalition from engaging in what look like war crimes. I also like to know why the U.S. is even involved. So there's two things going on, as all of you know, in Yemen. There are actions the U.S. is taking with our own assets to try to eliminate terrorists. No one is really disputing that the U.S. should try to eliminate terrorists. But there's something else going on, which is there's a civil war, and the U.S. is supporting this military coalition with refueling jets, providing other assistance, and then these jets are dropping bombs on civilians nowhere near military targets. And that, to me, is a massive concern. And now it's causing famine in Yemen, it's causing massive civilian carnage. And at the end of the day, this hurts U.S. national security, right? This is a big recruiting tool for terrorists. Every bomb that drops on a Yemeni child is something that causes damage to our national security. And I just want to read this paragraph from New York Times, which reported this week, and I quote, "Many strikes are carried out by pilots trained by the United States who fly American-made jets that are refueled in the air by American planes. And Yemenis often find the remains of American-made munitions, as they did in the ruins after a strike that killed more than 100 mourners at a funeral last month. Graffiti on walls across Sana'a reads, 'America is killing the Yemeni people.'" So in addition to the U.S. participating in direct military operations that result in bombs dropping on civilians, we've also given Saudi Arabia a mass amount of weapons over time, and like to find out what these weapons are being used for. Are these weapons also being used to carry out the killing of civilians in Yemen? And this hearing is being recorded, and your testimony is very important for future actions that Congress may take. And thank you again, Representative McGovern, for having this hearing.
Thank you. And I want to welcome our panel. We have James F. Jeffrey, currently the Philip Solons Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and a visiting instructor at George Washington University. He has served as ambassador in Ankara and in Baghdad. He served as an assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor to George W. Bush administration. We have Scott Paul, a senior humanitarian policy advisor at Oxfam, where he leads the organization's work on a number of emergencies and cross-cutting humanitarian issues in the United States, and has a very long and distinguished resume as well. Michael Bowers is the Vice President, Humanitarian Leadership and Response. He is responsible for leading and supporting Mercy Corps' global emergency operations, enhancing their quality and accountability, and ensuring that they bring the greatest benefit to the people in need. Krista Zimmerman joined Save the Children in 2014 and currently serves as the Associate Director for International Humanitarian Policy and Advocacy based in Washington, D.C. And again, also a very distinguished resume. We're happy you're here. Sanjeev Berry, and serves as Advocacy Director for the Middle East and North Africa at Amnesty International USA. He works with governments, NGOs, and others to advance human rights across the MENA region, and he's on TV a lot, and we're happy that you are here as well. And we look forward to your testimony. And Ambassador, why don't we begin with you?
It's not. Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chairman, Congressman Liu. It's an honor to be here today to talk about this subject. I'm not an expert in international humanitarian law the way that my colleagues are. I've been to Yemen, but I've done a great deal of work in the region more generally, and in particular, I've had many conversations on the overall subject that I'll get into in a second with the Saudi government, including twice with the Saudi foreign minister, with the Saudi king, crown prince, and deputy crown prince in the last 2 months. As a Foreign Service officer and military officer with 43 years of experience, there are two kinds of conflicts that I've been involved with repeatedly. One is a specific one in a region, think of Kashmir between India and Pakistan, or Sudan and South Sudan, that often generate tremendous violence, tremendous deaths among the civilian population. And then there are conflicts that fit into a larger context. If the conflict fits into a larger context, it's very hard to resolve it, to get ceasefires that hold. You saw what Secretary Kerry was just doing this week, without dealing with the larger context. I'm here to try to explain the larger context. I'm not an apologist for anyone, neither the Houthis nor the Hadi government, nor the Saudis, nor the U.S. government, but rather what I've seen in the region and how this fits into what's going on here. Because I believe the United States can play a role, and this role has to begin with taking effective action to get the Saudis to, and the other coalition members, to use much more care in delivering ordnance. I've seen how the U.S. military does it. It makes mistakes, but from time to time, as we're all aware, but generally we have a far higher standard than other countries, and we can, I think, move the Saudis to that standard. But only if we have an understanding of what's going on from their standpoint, and they believe that we are fully in on the larger struggle that they consider existential. That, in return, generates certain leverage that we can use beginning with the humanitarian problem. So what is this larger context? Having traveled around the region much in the last 6 months, what I've heard repeatedly is the fear in the region, not so much of ISIS, that's a problem that's big, but they figure is being contained by the United States and the coalition, but of Iran, Syria, now empowered by Russian intervention, and the threat that this is posing for the region as a whole. The Israelis sense that in from one perspective, the Turks in another, and the Arab states in particular, because they look around them and they see Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, all countries that are Arab, and only one of which has a majority Shia population, that find themselves in one or another internal conflict violent, or in the case of Lebanon, mainly political, generated by Iranian surrogates and Iranian power projection. Until there is a way to deal with that, the Saudis are likely to continue this military campaign with or without U.S. support. They'll find ways to come up with bombs. They'll find ways to come up with airplanes. So therefore, to the extent that it is in our interest as the United States to also contain this Iranian move throughout the region, and it is, and officially it's the U.S. government policy, although people question how strongly President Obama believes in it, that's the place to begin with the Saudis and the other coalition members, particularly the Emirates. So the first question is, who are the Saudis fighting in Yemen? As you mentioned, Congressman, they're first of all fighting the Houthi rebels. The Houthi rebels are not totally under the control of the Iranians, but they have an alliance of convenience with the Iranians. And what we have seen in the past, what I've seen in Iraq, in the south of Iraq, is these alliances tend to be strengthened because it's Iranian policy to strengthen them. The goal in every country that I've studied is to create a movement such as Hezbollah. The Saudi concern there, and they're seeing this every day in attacks, as you mentioned, across the border with some 500 Saudi casualties killed so far, is the development of something like the Hezbollah presence in southern Lebanon. Right now that has 150,000 missiles at least aimed at Israel. This is security problem number one for Israel today. The Saudis are absolutely determined, they stress this every time we talk to them, that they do not want to be in the position in southern Saudi Arabia that the Israelis are in much of Israel today, with an Iranian surrogate heavily armed by Iran on its borders. They have basically stated that they're going to fight until this threat is taken care of. They want us to work with them on it. That's not an unreasonable request, but in return, as you pointed out, we have to put on the table the need for our allies in this fight to fight it in a different way. You can fight effectively against an insurgent force or against a rebel force without targeting civilians or without doing an awful lot of collateral damage. I think that we can persuade the Saudis to do that. I think this is going to be tough, but I think that to the extent they feel that we understand their concerns and that we are not going to allow Yemen to become a second Lebanon or a second Iraq or a second Syria, I think that there's a way forward. But again, if we just turn around and say, sorry, we're not going to be involved in that, we won't be culpable, that's true, but this crisis is going to continue on and get worse in the context of a Middle East that is not getting better in a much, much larger sense than just Yemen. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bowers?
Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank the co-chairs, Representatives McGovern and Pitts, and Congressman Luke for holding this important and timely hearing and inviting Mercy Corps to testify, and I thank you for their Commission's continued leadership. Mercy Corps has been working in Yemen since 2010 in over 10 governments. We have a team of over 130 national and international staff in offices such as Sanaa, Taiz, and Aden. Our programming tackles humanitarian needs, including food security, water, sanitation, nutrition, and livelihoods. Unfortunately, my Yemeni colleagues cannot be here today to represent their perspectives, but I hope I can provide what they feel and provide enough testimony today to compel Congress to act. Ongoing violence in Yemen has resulted in over 21.2 million people, at least 80% of the population, in need of humanitarian assistance. Yemen currently faces one of the worst humanitarian crises of the world, and as you mentioned, is often not seen in the general public. While the recent announcement of a potential cessation of hostilities is a crucial first step in addressing the humanitarian catastrophe, the country will no doubt face many challenges as it moves to stabilize the economy, address humanitarian conditions, and undertake the process of healing social fragmentation. The longer the war rages on, the more the humanitarian crisis will continue to escalate, complicating the path towards long-term stability. As such, it is incumbent upon the United States and its allies to redouble efforts to support and bring about a negotiated end to this conflict. For instance, in Taiz, we have seen some of the worst fighting in the war. 50-year-old Etienne Mohammed, a mother of 4, shared her story with my Mercy Corps colleagues recently. Before the war, she and her husband sold goats to earn income. When fighting intensified in their village, Etienne and her family moved to Tai City and rented a small, broken-down apartment. Having lost their source of income, they have had to start borrowing money from relatives to pay their small rent and to buy food. But it wasn't enough, so Etienne and her husband started skipping dinner. Then there wasn't enough money for her family to even eat dinner. Quote, "Most nights we went to sleep hungry and we don't know what our next meal will come from," she said. They couldn't afford to send their children to school, and the kids started getting anxiety about missing their education. On top of all of this, as the war raged on in the city around them, they felt very heavy, she said. "I don't want to ask for help." Even prior to this crisis, Yemen was already the poorest country in the Middle East. Now, nearly 2 years since the escalation of the conflict, conditions are at an all-time low, and figures speak for themselves, as Congressman McGovern mentioned. The economy is on the verge of collapse. Less than half the health facilities are functioning, while health officials have confirmed a recent cholera outbreak, and famine is only one step away in some parts of the country. A staggering 19 of the 22 governments are under food security phase 3, which is a crisis, or phase 4, which is considered an emergency, with phase 5 being famine in general. In total, 14.4 million people are food insecure, more than half the population. The vast majority of Yemen's population also lacks access to water and sanitation services, which are critical to maintaining good health. In Tai's governorate, one of the most food insecure regions of the country and where food prices are the highest, Mercy Corps provides emergency nutrition services to children and women. What we found is startling. Of nearly 10,000 children under 5 years old that were screened for malnutrition between November 2015 and January 2016, 7% were found to be severely, acutely malnourished. That is double the rate that we expected. The number is staggering, even more so when considering that children with severe acute malnutrition are 9 times more likely to die than children who are well nourished. To make matters worse, the country is in the midst of the economic crisis, compounded by inflated food and fuel prices, a dwindling foreign reserve, and a massive cash shortage. The Central Bank of Yemen, once one of the few neutral institutions in the country, has become a political pawn between the warring parties. This institution that once helped Yemen maintain some semblance of economic stability is now on the verge of failure. The CBY is no longer able to pay public sector salaries, provide lines of credit for essential imports like wheat, and service debt obligations. Alongside the challenges facing the bank, imports of basic commodities into the country, including food and fuel, are scarce, continue to face blockages at ports. Throughout the country, economic infrastructure is also being devastated by the widespread bombing of factories, fishing boats, roads, and bridges, and a continuous threat of airstrikes on truck traffic, which has made some areas of the country essentially unreachable by humanitarian aid agencies. Of particular concern, cash shortages resulting from Yemen's economic collapse have been a pervasive impact on Mercy Corps' humanitarian program in the country and our ability to help Yemenis build more productive lives. At the same time, the value of the Yemeni rial continues to shrink, affecting markets and the purchasing power of Yemenis. They have resulted in adverse impacts on our food voucher programs, our cash for work, and our unconditional emergency cash transfers. Water and sanitation work and in-kind food for assistance have become basic operational hindrances due to cash shortages. For instance, shortages of cash have affected our ability to properly compensate vendors and suppliers as part of our food vouchers and infrastructure rehabilitation work. If we are unable to properly pay vendors in the middle of a project, then we are unable to meet the urgent needs of the most vulnerable households. The loss of income and livelihoods, in conjunction with high prices of food and fuel and essential commodities, has further undermined people's ability to cope with the effects of the war. In the years since March 2015, around a quarter of the companies in Yemen have closed, and 70% of Yemeni laborers have been laid off, while prices of wheat, flour, sugar, onions, and red beans remain higher in pre-crisis period. This is an even more severe blow to over 1.5 million of Yemen's most vulnerable families, who previously relied on emergency assistance through a Yemeni social welfare fund. In total, 1.2 million breadwinners and estimated 7 million dependents have not seen wages in 3 months, only serving to accelerate the already devastating food crisis. With only 45% of health facilities fully functioning due to damage, shortages of medicines, and inadequate staffing, in part due to a lack of salaries. The banking crisis clearly affects the most crucial public services. Blockages at Yemen's major ports and the discontinuation of lines of credit from central bank for the import of basic food continue to restrict both commercial activity and humanitarian assistance. Currently, a few seaports are operational, face long import processes, and are often cut off from major swaths of the country. The United Nations verification and inspection mechanism has been successful in mediating and allowing for millions of metric tons of food, fuel, and supplies to arrive. Yet there is still a backlog of ships just waiting to offload. When they do offload, the process can take around 1 month to complete due to inadequate port capacity. This matters because prior to the war, around 90% of Yemen's basic food items, such as wheat, were imported. Nearly 2 years into the escalated conflict, the price of wheat remains 25% higher than before. In practical terms, port blockages coupled with the discontinuation of lines of credit are having a devastating impact. As humanitarian actors, we are also deeply concerned about the widespread disregard for civilian protection by parties to the conflict. Evidence most shockingly on October 8th, 2016, the deadly double-tap airstrike on that funeral in the capital, perpetrated by Saudi-led coalition, killed at least 140 civilians and injured 525 others. Following that attack, Mercy Corps, along with colleague agencies, urged the United States government to use its leverage to require compliance with international humanitarian law by the Saudi-led coalition as a condition of U.S. cooperation and support, and asked the U.S. to support calls for an independent investigation into the attacks on civilians. Today, I echo that call. That funeral attack is just another in a long, targeted attacks on civilians and vital infrastructure, including health facilities, schools, factories, and bridges. The recklessness of the Saudi-led operation in Yemen indicates a fundamental unwillingness or inability to comply with the basic laws governing welfare. However, in September, just a month before the bombing, Congress approved $1.15 billion of weapons to Saudi Arabia. This deal signals a lack of concern by the U.S. government for the civilian loss of life, injuries, and the destruction of infrastructure now in Yemen, and reinforces the permissiveness of the current Saudi-led coalition operations. Introducing more weapons has the potential to exacerbate the fighting and put more civilians at risk. I'd like to leave you a few recommendations and steps for the U.S. Congress to take to address for humanitarian needs in Yemen. First, commit $1.6 billion to fund the Food for Peace account. To fight global hunger, save lives, and help famines survive, and help families survive, I should say, particularly the 7 million people in Yemen facing emergency levels, we need Congress to fund Food for Peace at the Senate level of $1.6 billion for FY 2017. We also need congressional support for the Community Development Fund, a critical fund that allows the U.S. government to ensure that food programs are operated effectively and efficiently to create the biggest impact possible. The current draft of the House Agricultural Appropriations Bill includes language that limits the use of the Community Development Fund to meet, quote, the safe box required funding level of $350 million. This language would, in effect, force the USAID to turn to monetization and prevents $80 million additional being used on the emergency side for Food for Peace, funds that could be used to help Yemen. If this provision is included in the final conference agreement, it would pull life-saving food aid from approximately 2 million people. I hope the Human Rights Commission can weigh in and whether their appropriations colleagues can rectify this problem through a legislative fix and at no cost to the U.S. taxpayer that could cover and help over 2 million. Secondly, maintain high levels account for humanitarian needs. Support no less than $2.8 billion for the International Disaster Assistance Account and $3.2 billion for the migration and refugee assistance to address the vast needs throughout the country, and particularly to address rising food insecurity, water and sanitation. The OCHA Humanitarian Response Plan was only 51% funded in 2016. The 2017 plan could be released early next year, and in order to turn around that abysmal level of global attention to the humanitarian needs in Yemen, we call on the U.S. Congress and its leadership in a role in funding. Third, and this is a concrete ask, urge the U.S. Treasury and Department of State to work with the Central Bank of Yemen to find a political compromise that allows for cooperation between Aden and Sana'a and the full resumption of core functions as quickly as possible. The U.S. Treasury, in coordination with the U.S. Department of State, should work with technocrats on the two arms of CBY to draw upon an agreement for the resumption of core functions that impact humanitarian services, potentially as part of initial steps to build confidence by parties to the conflict toward a negotiated peace. In particular, their immediate needs: pay the country 1.2 million civil servants who, as heads of households, are breadwinners for nearly 7 million people. It would restart support for the Social Welfare Fund, which previously provided aid to the poorest segments of society, and resume lines of credits for import of basic foodstuffs. It would also stabilize the real and alleviate the country's liquidity crisis with its physical banknote distribution at both branches. Fourth, we need to seek solutions to address the logistical delays at Yemen's ports. Import restrictions are resulting in delays that continue to inhibit commercial activity and provision of essential goods. The U.S. should pressure the Saudi-led coalition to cooperate with the UN verification mission so import processes are not further delayed to stop targeting. Fifth, ask the U.S. administration to provide details about their timeline and implementation of its review of the Saudi-led coalition, and to condition continued support for the Saudi-led coalition's military operations in Yemen on the adoption of measures to enhance compliance with international humanitarian law and to minimize civilian harm. Continued U.S. support should be based upon demonstrable improvement in the conduct of hostilities, including by refraining from indiscriminate and disproportionate use of force, such as attacks on medical facilities and schools. While we welcome October 8th statement made by the National Security Council spokesperson announcing the U.S. government intention to review its support for the SLC, we find it disconcerting that the U.S. support has not already taken. Sixth, and finally, support a transparent investigation into violations of international humanitarian law. Through the Security Council, support an immediate, independent, and international investigation into the incident and other alleged violations of IHL under the auspices of the UN Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights to hold these responsible for IHL violations. In conclusion, Yemen is at a critical juncture, but I have hope for its future. When Mercy Corps began providing food assistance through our voucher program, in partnership with the food program, Etidal, this woman I mentioned earlier, was a beneficiary. Each month, her family received enough food to allow them to save a little bit more that they would normally spend on food rations. With the money they've saved, her family now has opened up a small shop that now sells chickens. They've earned some money and able to send their children back to school. So there's real proof your support can help. Thank you so much for your consideration.
Thank you very much, Mr. Paul. I probably should just give you a little, we're going to have a series of votes shortly, so all your testimonies will be admitted to the record in its entirety, so if you want to summarize, that would be helpful. And before we go to you, I want to yield to my co-chair, Mr. Pitts, who has a statement, and I just also want to publicly say this is his last hearing. I think as the co-chair of the Human Rights Commission, Mr. Pitts has decided to do the same thing and go on to pursue other things other than being here. But I just want to say this, people always talk about all the division that exists here in Congress, but on the issue of human rights, there has been some remarkable consensus and bipartisan work, and he's a conservative Republican from Pennsylvania. I'm a liberal Democrat from Massachusetts, but I have great admiration for his commitment to human rights, and it's been a real privilege for me to be able to serve alongside of him on this commission. So I want to yield to my friend, Mr. Pitts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Really appreciate you holding this important hearing. This is a difficult issue for Congress, and that's why your leadership is so important. And I have really, it's been a great honor to work with you and serve with you in this capacity. I've been humbled by the opportunity to serve this body by promoting policy that honor human dignity and fraternity. And I would like to thank the Commission's staff. I appreciate the hard work that everyone has been doing this Congress, especially in helping my office navigate my responsibility. And I just want to highlight my gratitude to Jim McGovern as co-chair for all of his hard work. The bipartisanship, the professionalism, the charity that Congressman McGovern has displayed during my tenure gives me great hope for this body and its future. Congress is in good hands under his leadership. And so I thank you for your commitment, for your leadership, For all of those of you who champion dignity and human rights, we appreciate the opportunity to be with you this morning. I apologize that we're being interrupted by floor votes, but I look forward to reading all of your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Paul?
Thank you, both honorable co-chairs, and I'm lucky now to be at this moment to be able to congratulate both of you on all of the work you've done, and thank Co-Chairman Pitts for all of his leadership over the years. Also especially grateful to be presenting here in front of Congressman Liu, whose bold advocacy has really put Yemen and the U.S. role in Yemen on the map. I'll do my best to summarize the remainder of my testimony so we can get through this, so we can get through the remainder of our witnesses. It should be, but there we go. That's probably better. I speak today on behalf of Oxfam, which has worked in Yemeni communities for more than 33 years, supporting women and youth advocates and fighting endemic poverty. In the face of daunting security and logistical challenges, we're targeting areas most affected by the conflict in northern and southern governorates. Thus far, we've reached more than 900,000 people since the start of the crisis. Over 21 million people, or 4 out of 5 in Yemen, more than any other country in the world, are in need of immediate, life-saving humanitarian assistance. Over 3 million people have fled their homes. Over 7 million are on the verge of starvation. Over 10,000 civilians have been killed or injured by fighting, with tens of thousands more dying from preventable and treatable diseases. All armed actors in Yemen have demonstrated their disregard for the well-being of civilians. This includes the Saudi-led coalition, whose airstrikes have been confirmed by the United Nations and human rights organizations to be either indiscriminate, disproportionate, or directly targeting civilians or civilian objects. Saudi airstrikes have hit weddings and schools. They have hit hospitals and clinics. In total, independent experts concluded that over 1/3 of airstrikes carried out between March 2015 and August 2016 struck non-military sites. These included 2 Oxfam facilities, a warehouse and a European Commission-funded solar panel, both of which were destroyed. Thankfully, none of our staff were injured. The most wide-ranging impact of coalition airstrikes has been economic. Farms, factories, warehouses, and power plants have all been frequently damaged and destroyed in airstrikes. In addition to ensuring the supply of food, electricity, medicine, and other household goods to the population, these facilities were a major source of employment in Yemen. For example, in Khamr, a small city in Amran Governorate I visited in August, I spoke with Yemenis participating in an Oxfam-funded project to remove waste and debris from the streets. Many of them were former employees of the Amran cement factory, which was destroyed in a Saudi airstrike in February. They had been unable to find other work since the bombing of the factory and insisted that but for the money they earned from the cleanup project, they would not survive. Perhaps the principal cause of Yemen's humanitarian crisis is the country's failing economy, though. Soon after it began its military campaign, the Saudi-led coalition began to withhold permission for humanitarian and commercial vessels to berth in Yemen's Houthi-controlled Red Sea ports. Yemen, as my colleague mentioned, depends on imports to meet about 90% of its food needs. Imports fell dramatically and food prices spiked. The resultant fuel shortage affected not only personal transportation, but also water purification, sanitation, the milling of grain, the operation of hospitals, and the refrigeration of food and pharmaceuticals. Shipping conditions, including the reduced capacity of Hodeidah port due to an August 2015 Saudi attack, continued to create delays, reduce imports, and raise food prices. Meanwhile, the Central Bank of Yemen's declining foreign reserves and relocation to Aden have shaken confidence in the banking system, further exacerbating the lack of imports. The banking crisis has also halted the payment of salaries to Yemen's 1.2 million civil servants, who are breadwinners for as many as 6 million people. Now, grain supplies are running low, and suppliers tell us that there is no more to come for at least 3 months. If the CBY remains unstable, poorly managed, and without adequate foreign reserves, a dramatic downturn in the food security situation and health outcomes for Yemeni families will soon follow. Although Yemeni parties in the Saudi-led coalition together are to blame for Yemen's descent into humanitarian crisis, U.S. policy has also helped to prolong and exacerbate the situation. The U.S. government, in my view, has adopted an incoherent and ethically indefensible policy, pleading for peace while fueling the war. Let me first mention some constructive aspects of U.S. engagement very briefly. The administration has repeatedly called for dialogue and reconciliation and opposed any attempt by any armed faction to take power by force. The U.S. has also been the world's largest humanitarian donor. And Secretary Kerry's most recent initiative, the agreement of a cessation of hostilities and peace agreement over the objections of the government of Yemen, is a heroic effort. But the administration's positive moves have been undercut by its overriding focus on bilateral relations with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. In November 2015, the State Department approved a sale of $1.29 billion in precision-guided munitions intended to replenish supplies depleted due to the high operational tempo of Saudi air operations. The American Bar Association concluded that this assistance must be suspended pending a credible investigation. Congress's acquiescence to the sale sent a strong message that U.S. support remains a blank check. On October 8th this year, you all know of the devastating bombing of a funeral in the Great Hall of Sana'a. The same day, the U.S. government announced that it would undertake a review of U.S. assistance to Saudi Arabia's military intervention in Yemen. Despite the continuation of airstrikes and an ongoing pattern of civilian casualty incidents, U.S. support continues. It seems the U.S. government review is no more than a policy of increased concern, combined with a hope that peace will come before hard decisions have to be made. We sincerely hope, but have little reason to believe, that this will be the case. Thank you again for convening this important hearing.
Thank you. Ms. Zimmerman?
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman McGovern, Congressman Liu. Thank you for the invitation to speak with you today about the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. My colleagues have already talked about how the conflict is driving hunger, depressing economic futures, and causing immeasurable human suffering. As acceptable as these conditions should be on their own, it is sadly the widespread and repeated cases of grave violations against children that make this conflict particularly terrible for children. The UN Security Council has identified 6 categories of violations against children that are termed the grave violations, all of which we are seeing perpetrated in Yemen. These include the killing and maiming of children, the use of child soldiers, sexual violence against children, attacks against schools and hospitals, denial of humanitarian access, and the abduction of children. From March 2015 through mid-September of this year, the UN monitoring and reporting mechanism verified more than 3,000 child casualties. This doesn't include the funeral attacks in October, so we know those numbers are going to go up. The UN has also attributed 60% of child deaths in Yemen to coalition airstrikes. Though ground attacks, including shelling and small arms fire, landmines, and unexploded ordnance, are also responsible for child casualties. Not surprisingly, children are particularly vulnerable to injury by explosive weapons during conflict, as well as the explosive remnants of war from which the risks remain long after. One little boy in Yemen described his experience to us as follows. I was playing in the street, and one of my friends found a strange thing on the ground. He took it and was playing with it when it started to shoot fire. A few seconds later, it exploded. We were all injured. People came to take us to the hospital, and later I found out that my friends had been killed, including my best friend. Now I hate everyone who uses weapons. Since March of 2015, there have also been at least 240 attacks on schools and hospitals. More than 1,600 schools are currently unfit for use due to conflict-related damage, because they are being used to house internally displaced persons, or because they have been occupied by armed forces. Recent attacks on schools include a reported airstrike in a school in Sana'a in August, in which 10 children were killed. Hospitals have also been damaged and destroyed, and a new survey by the World Health Organization finds that in 16 of Yemen's governments, that half of all health facilities are closed or partially functioning, and that there are critical shortages of medical doctors in 40% of all districts. In order to improve conditions for children in Yemen and curtail the high rate of grave violations against children, Save the Children agrees with many of the recommendations that have been already offered by my colleagues here, but I'd like to highlight 2 in particular that we think are important. First, we think it's important that the U.S. continue to engage and to support the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and its investigation into human rights violations in Yemen. We believe that with adequate resources, including the addition of enough experts, including child rights experts, and the full cooperation of all parties to the conflict, the process could help ensure accountability for violations of international law, including grave violations against children. That said, its setup must be accelerated, and Yemeni authorities must facilitate its work, including by issuing visas and permitting unrestricted access to all areas of the country. We need to keep a sharp eye on this process going forward, and in the event that its work is obstructed, quickly consider alternative approaches, such as with the UN Secretary General, the Security Council, or an HRC-mandated commission of inquiry. And then I'd just like to make a quick note. I've talked here about children and the grave violations against children. The kind that we're seeing perpetrated in Yemen are of top concern, but they're also happening in other places. In fact, we think there's a de facto war on children taking place in conflicts around the world. And Save the Children would very much like to see the United States government take a stronger stand to speak out and protect children during conflict. It can do this in a number of ways, but two quick suggestions would be simply even the public expression of concern for the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, and reinforcing the urgent need for global leaders to address this issue, including working on the political declaration that is ongoing right now at the United Nations. We'd also like to see the US sign the Safe Schools Declaration, a voluntary instrument that's already been endorsed by 56 countries, and would include commitments to improving data collection on attacks against schools, as well as endorsement of the guidelines for protecting schools and universities from military use during armed conflict. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Berry?
Thank you, Chairman McGovern and Congressman Liu. It's a privilege to speak here today on behalf of Amnesty International and Amnesty International USA. And I also want to say a big thank you to each of you and your offices for your hard work over the past year or more in elevating these issues in the U.S. Congress, which has had significant impacts in the debate both in the House as well as the Senate. And I think has played a critical role in elevating the debate over the nature of U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia, a debate that might not have happened if it weren't for the hard work of your offices. So thank you for that as well. It's been a privilege to work with your offices on this issue. You know, we welcome this opportunity to address the Commission on this important subject of the crisis in Yemen. I have more details in my submitted written testimony. I'll just cover a few quick points right now. Since the conflict began, Amnesty International researchers have conducted multiple research missions in Yemen. Our researchers have directly documented human rights abuses and violations of international humanitarian law, including war crimes, by the Saudi Arabia-led military coalition and the Houthi armed group. Our latest research mission just concluded earlier this week, and we will be publicizing our findings in the days ahead. It's clear that all the parties to the conflict have committed violations and abuses, though it's worth noting that only Saudi Arabia and its coalition have the military capability for aerial bombardment or air-to-ground strikes. The Saudi Arabia-led coalition's pattern of attacks across Yemen raises serious concerns about an apparent disregard for civilian life. This is reflected in a failure to take feasible precautions to spare civilians as required by international humanitarian law. Amnesty International researchers who visited sites bombed by the Saudi Arabia-led coalition found both unexploded U.S. bombs and identifiable fragments of exploded U.S. bombs among the ruins of Yemeni homes and other civilian objects. Amnesty International has reviewed photographs of bomb fragments, including a bomb fin, found on site by locals who live next to and witnessed the bombing of the Doctors Without Borders hospital in northwestern Yemen on August 15th. Based on two experts' analysis, Amnesty International has identified the bomb used in this attack as a Paveway series bomb of U.S. manufacture. The Houthi armed group and forces allied to it, including army forces loyal to former President Ali Abdullah Saleh, have also committed numerous violations and abuses of international human rights and humanitarian law. It's a long list of abuses committed by the Houthi armed groups and the forces allied to it. Some examples have included endangering civilians by deploying in densely populated neighborhoods, launching attacks from or near populated homes, schools, and hospitals, firing weapons indiscriminately into civilian populated areas in Yemen and southern Saudi Arabia, and laying internationally banned anti-personnel landmines that have killed and maimed dozens of civilians. Clearly, all parties to the conflict have committed human rights abuses and violations of international humanitarian law. With regards to the Saudi Arabia-led coalition, despite the coalition's human rights violations and record of human rights violations, the Obama administration has persisted in selling billions of dollars in arms to Saudi Arabia and other coalition members. As a consequence, the Obama administration risks U.S. complicity in the Saudi Arabia-led coalition's serious violations of international humanitarian law in Yemen, including likely war crimes. Amnesty International USA has three core recommendations for the U.S. government to take to address Yemen's human rights crisis, which is driving its humanitarian crisis. One, the U.S. government should end all arms sales and arms transfers to Saudi Arabia and members of the Saudi Arabia-led coalition that could be used in the conflict in Yemen. Two, the U.S. government should support a comprehensive embargo on arms transfers that could be used by any party to the conflict in Yemen, while there remains a substantial risk the arms would be used to commit or facilitate war crimes or other serious violations. Finally, the U.S. government should support an international, independent investigation into civilian deaths and injuries in Yemen. The investigation should address alleged serious violations and abuses of international human rights and humanitarian law committed by all parties to the conflict in Yemen. The investigation should establish the facts, collect and preserve information related to violations and abuses, with a view to ensuring that those responsible for crimes are brought to justice in fair trials. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much, and the good news is we get through everybody's testimony. The bad news is they just called for votes. So we're gonna take a break if that's okay. Just we have I think only 2 votes. There's a few more. How many? Well, there's a few votes. Hopefully, it will not be too long. But let me just say that I appreciate the testimony and I appreciate the recommendations, because that's part of what we're trying to figure out here is like what can we do in the short term to follow up and to be constructive here, because it is such a tragic situation, and so I appreciate all those. But we're gonna break for these votes, and then we'll be back. So I apologize for that, but we're not in control of this stuff. So if we were, we would not have any votes until everything was done. But be that as may,
Congressman, as you, I'm sure, have taught to many people, contains some very specific principles with regards to distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants, as well as questions of proportionality. And through the application of those basic principles to the places that have been hit by the Saudi-led coalition strikes, it becomes very clear when a hospital is struck, for example, and there are no documented combatants in the area, or any strikes coming or attacks coming from the area, when schools are being struck, these sorts of things, when marketplaces are being struck, it quickly becomes clear that these are not military targets and they're not justifiable targets. And as a consequence of that, our researchers, as well as the other organizations that join that statement that you refer to, are able to pretty clearly say that these are likely war crimes and certainly in violation of international humanitarian law.
How do you know the Houthis then strike those targets?
Well, it depends on the nature of the strike. The Houthis and their affiliated groups don't have access to the aerial capacity, the air war capacity of the Saudi-led coalition. In some cases you find actual bomb fragments that clearly the Houthis and their allied groups don't have access to. And those simple facts that emerge in the rubble can point researchers in the right direction.
Have you updated your report since then? Because I think the number is around 70 unlawful airstrikes. Have you seen additional ones?
So I need to go back to that report to see what the qualifier was around the 70. I'm not sure we were arguing that there were just 70 as opposed to 70 or so specific strikes that had been investigated. The total may be vastly
I see.
higher. Early on in the conflict, the Saudi-led coalition declared an entire city to be a military target, Sada, and they flattened marketplaces and homes and, significant bombardment. So there may well be orders of magnitude more strikes that are unlawful under IHL principles. Those are specific ones that have been investigated.
When the Saudi coalition said that an entire city was a legitimate military target, was that in a document? Did they say it?
I don't remember what the actual source was. It was made public the bombardment happened, and I believe later they attempted to walk that back, but I don't remember if that was a quote, a printed statement, or what the format was.
And do you or anyone in the panel know if the U.S. objected to that when the U.S. looked at this and saw Saudi Arabia had essentially declared an entire civilian city as a military target? Did the U.S. say anything?
Congressman, I was assured at the time the U.S. did say something. As far as I remember, what happened, and this was, I think, in late May of 2015, the Saudi Royal Air Force dropped leaflets on the city of Sada saying the city is now a, quote, I think the way it was translated was a military zone, and all non-combatants were urged to urgently leave the city. And they said it would become a military zone, I believe, within 3 or 4 hours of when the leafleting took place. So that was, the leaflet was what we saw. We have staff who were in the area, and we have an office in Sada that had been closed for quite some time, but they saw the leaflets. And then I was told the U.S. government did object privately to the Saudis.
And Mr. Beery, in your Amnesty International report, it did set out principles of international law, and is it your belief that it's a violation of international law and a law of war to target an entire civilian city as a military target?
Absolutely. It's a complete violation of international law, international humanitarian law, to target entire cities in that way. There's no process of selecting military targets or differentiating between combatants and non-combatants when you target an entire city or an entire community in that manner.
Thank you. Mr. Powell, thank you for your testimony. As you know, Saudi Arabia has signed on to the additional protocol of the August 1949 Geneva Convention, and that states, "It is prohibited to attack, destroy, remove, or render useless objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, such as foodstuffs, agricultural areas for the production of foodstuffs, crops, livestock, for the specific purpose of denying them for the sustenance value to the civilian population, whatever the motive." Is it your view that the Saudi Arabia coalition is targeting agricultural places such as farms? And if so, do you believe they're violating the 1949 Geneva Convention?
Thank you, Congressman. I should make a disclaimer here by saying I have a personal interest and background in international humanitarian law, but my organization doesn't have an investigative capacity. So what we've done is we've relied heavily on the reporting of organizations like Amnesty International and the United Nations, as well as our own observations in the field. What I can say is that on the basis of our observations, there does appear to be a pattern of attacks that have affected farms and other food production-related facilities. So we as an organization aren't in a position to draw ourselves a conclusion about the compliance of the Saudi-led coalition with respect to Additional Protocol 1. But I think the pattern that we see and the intent we can probably infer from that would probably give a pretty good basis for some of those groups to draw a conclusion themselves.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Zimmerman, thank you for your testimony. You had referenced an airstrike that Saudi Arabia, the coalition, did on a school that killed multiple children, injured many more. What the military coalition has said is they believe that that was not a school and it was a training camp for soldiers. Do you have any insight into whether that was true or not?
I don't on that specific one, but I can say that what we're seeing is, far from isolated incidents of a few schools being targeted. It's widespread and recurring. The other thing I think we're seeing is that the risks that the coalition seems to be willing to take in terms of damaging children in any number of ways are risks that we don't normally see from kind of nation states that are concerned with international humanitarian law and proportionality and making judgments that would reduce harm to civilians and specifically to children.
There was a UN document that was going to list Saudi Arabia as essentially committing crimes against children. Can you explain what that was and where the status is of that document?
I believe that was with the SRSG's office. So, I mean, we understood that Saudi Arabia was going to be listed, and then there was a draft of the document that did, in fact, have Saudi Arabia listed on, but before it became official, Saudi Arabia was removed from that list. It's something that we expressed concern about with the UN Secretary General directly, actually, and many others did also. I think it's fair to say that we were surprised that Saudi Arabia was removed from that listing.
Okay, thank you. Ambassador Jeffrey, thank you for your decades of service. I appreciate that. I understand your point as to why Saudi Arabia is in this conflict. But don't you think if the U.S. was more forceful in public statements or actions about the conduct of the coalition, that would actually do more to limit what look like war crimes? Because we've been involved now for over 18 months. It doesn't appear that things have gotten better. And the current administration seems, to me, enormously reticent to publicly call out what these are, which they look like war crimes. I don't know why we wouldn't do that in a more forceful manner, and just want to see what your thoughts are.
Yep, I can't give the specific rationale for why the administration takes exactly the position it does, Congressman. I have my ideas, but for the moment I'll put those to one side. I'll give you, I think, a more direct answer from my own experiences in many of these conflicts going back to Vietnam. Were this conflict comparable to, using Yemen as example, the Egyptian campaign in Yemen in the 1960s, which involved poison gas and other things, that was part of then President Nasser's attempt to expand his power as a sort of national objective, but was not a national security problem for Egypt on one hand. Then us speaking out, or in that case at the time the Soviets speaking out, or others who are providing a country weapons and diplomatic cover, can have a huge impact. That still applies with us in the case of Saudi Arabia and its allies in Yemen to some degree, which I'll get to in a second. The problem is this is a different kind of war. From the standpoint of the Saudis and the Emiratis and some of the other people who are supporting them, this is both a war right on their doorsteps. Again, the analogy of Lebanon. There were many concerns by some of the organizations here about the Israeli actions in Lebanon in 2006 and previous, and the Israelis pulled out. There was a UN resolution that I was up in New York present when we worked it out, and one side did not adhere to it, the Israelis did, and they're now sitting with 150,000 rockets, most of which against that UN resolution came in after 2006. That's the reality these people are living in the region. I absolutely believe the U.S. can and should speak out against the Saudis and say, you need to do much more to avoid civilian casualties. You don't win wars this way. We've seen this from our own experience. And secondly, you destroy your diplomatic position. But from and I can't put words in any specific Saudi official's mouth, but my very significant and extensive conversations with them in the last few months is that we'll only be able to do that and have that kind of leverage if our position is we will find ways to ensure, be it diplomacy with our new friends Iran, be it pressure on Oman, where the weapons, including the missiles fired at our ships, probably came from, be it a tighter embargo, be it better efforts diplomatically, be it other efforts militarily with you, to ensure that over our dead bodies, Yemen will never become a second Lebanon. If we said that to the Saudis, rather than, and I have to criticize the president here, saying to the Jeff Greenberg in the Atlantic, the Saudis just have to learn to share the Middle East with Iran, I think the Saudis might listen. Right now, they're not listening to us, and I don't think they will, unless we change our policy.
Thank you. That is interesting. There was a Reuters article
that stated that State Department officials, including their lawyers, had raised concerns that U.S. assistance to the direct military operations in Yemen would open up U.S. liability for war crimes, for aiding and abetting potential war crimes. It appears that they didn't come to an answer on that, and the State Department continued forward. Is that unusual for the State Department to sort of go forward without getting a legal answer as to whether or not these are war crimes?
Yeah, in my time in the State Department, particularly in the National Security Council, Congressman, where we dealt with, given an open session, I'd have to say, activities against terrorists around the region, there's a constant friction between almost anything you do, given the nature of war crimes, be it as defined in international humanitarian law, and then the degree to which international humanitarian law is applicable legally as opposed to politically or diplomatically on the U.S., the role of the ICC and other things, and with concepts such as proportionality, you argue all of these things with the lawyers ad nauseum, and that's the wrong word, but basically forever, because they're very important. You're dealing with people's lives, and you're also dealing with very important security things. And nobody ever emerges from these discussions happy. The people who want to strike targets, who we feel are, for American security and the security of our allies, often feel that their hands are tied. The people who are trying to adhere to strict standards of accountability, strict standards of humanitarian treatment, and avoidance of civilian casualties often also are disappointed. I would cite, I know of no administration that's been more careful with civilian casualties in military operations in our history than this one. And I have known no activity where more effort was put into it than in the drone strikes. But as you know, the administration itself recently came out and listed its own list of casualties, and they're in the hundreds.
And that's why this Yemen crisis is so startling to me, because I do agree with you that the administration, when we're dealing with our own strikes, is very careful. But there is now statements from administration saying we're refueling Saudi Arabia military coalition jets, not knowing what they're doing. We have no idea what targets they're going to strike. And that strikes me as wrong and remarkable, given that we've known for the last 18 months about a third of these bombs are going to drop on a civilian. And as you know, there's an entire State Department office dedicated to war crimes, trying to tell other countries not to engage in war crimes. Would you agree that our conduct in this military operation in Yemen would undercut that office and what the administration has been trying to do in terms of preventing war crimes?
You've got a point, Congressman, but having yielded that, I would have to say undercut, as you know, as a former Air Force lawyer, is a somewhat imprecise term. But I grant it undercuts as an imprecise term. I'll be totally honest with you. When I first heard the request to come forward, usually it's on Syria or ISIS, themes that I know more about than Yemen, although, as I said, I've been there. And this one I was a little bit uncomfortable about, because I'm kind of uncomfortable about this whole thing. And I think that President Obama and Secretary Kerry are very uncomfortable as well. Here's the problem, to be totally blunt about this. If we're going to talk about humanitarian crisis and the killing of civilians in this region, in terms of quantity of a ratio of probably 99 to 1, with Yemen being the one, and in terms of quality, in a negative sense, the deliberate policy of going after civilian areas, we're talking about Syria. This administration, for reasons I don't agree with, but I have some understanding for, decided to stay out of the Syrian war in any real sense. And in so doing has not only certainly not contributed to, in any great significant way, to ending the horrible violence there, but in the eyes of the Saudis and many others in the region, most others in the region, is thereby facilitating a geostrategic shift in power that these countries see as existential. It's not just the 500 Saudis who have died from attacks across the border. It's the whole Lebanon situation, the whole Shia militias in Iraq thing. That's how they perceive it. Because the administration, for whatever reasons, decided not to do that, I think they decided they couldn't totally abandon our allies in the Middle East, and thus we're giving them a walk on Yemen.
Thank you. Appreciate your testimony. And finally, Mr. Bowers, thank you for your testimony and recommendations. It does strike me as absurd that we're refueling military jets that bomb civilians and civilian farms, and then we're also spending money providing humanitarian assistance caused by those jets that we just refueled that dropped the bombs. But that's a situation that we're seeing. And you had mentioned that one of your recommendations was the Community Development Fund. Can you explain a little bit more how that works and how it would help the people in Yemen?
To my understanding right now, I think the draft language in the House Agricultural Appropriations Bill limits the flexibility in which our colleagues at USAID can utilize funding for the appropriate amount of emergency food aid. So the Community Development Fund isn't necessarily meant to exercise itself in both an emergency and a development setting, but what we're asking is not to limit the amount of appropriations. So I think the safe box limit of 350 would mean in effect USAID, as is Food for Peace, would have to utilize other tools such as monetizing food aid, in-kind assistance, which we think is a less flexible, less responsive method. So right now, the language in the House bill would basically tie the hands of our friends at Food for Peace to appropriate money that is already there. So it's not new money, but money that can't be used in the facility we want to use.
Thank you. I appreciate all of you being here. I want to thank you for your time and your interest in this area. And the hearing is now adjourned. Thank you.